we go. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's kick off today. Welcome back to another eRequesting technical design group. This one has been scheduled at 90 minutes. We'll see how we go for the hour-and-a-half period, and also look to talk about that as an agenda item today. We've got on our agenda the usual business that we do at the beginning of every meeting, going through our approval of minutes and updates from any other previous meetings and any other updates or news. While we have been doing an update on the eRequesting data set for interoperability, what we really got there is covering off when the next meeting is, the joint one that I think people should have gotten invites for, which I'll talk about that when we get to it. And then Andy's going to take us through in getting stuck into getting around data mapping and also looking at principles. And then we're going to cover off our meeting cadence and when our next meeting of this group will be. So as per our usual business, and we look to approve the minutes of the previous meeting, they were sent out for review. There's no outstanding feedback on those. And just bring those up now. So they're here and they've been available for review. A couple of people have made some additions to this, which is great. Thank you. And so I'm going to ask, is someone happy to motion to approve the minutes of our previous meeting?
Motion Danielle, it's Christy.
Okay, thanks, Christy. And I heard someone else. Is that a seconder?
Yeah, I'll second that, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Are there any other comments and questions on the meeting minutes people want to take before we launch our meeting poll to take that vote? All right, I'm not hearing anything. So I'll launch our meeting poll now. Everyone should see that. Go through, please, and vote to affirm the minutes, abstain if you weren't at that meeting, and vote negative if you think that we shouldn't be approving those minutes. Sorry, did someone have a question? Okay, thanks everyone. I will end that poll and I'll share the results. The motion is carried. Those minutes are now passed. Stop sharing that. And come back. So update on the actions. There are 3 actions we've been carrying through. 2 of those are new from the last meeting. And we also have one that we've carried through from the meeting before that. Angus or David, do you have an update or comment you want to bring to the group on that action?
Just that we haven't resolved it yet. We're meeting at 3 p.m. today to see if we can figure it out. I don't think it's particularly complex. We just haven't got to it yet.
Okay, no worries. We'll carry that through then to the next meeting and look for an update from you there. The other 2 actions coming out of our last meeting were on me. And I took an action to provide a means for us to do prioritization of features. And I've sent that out via email it's the Confluence page now. And that basically has updated the feature page. And I'll just show you now what that looks like. So that's updated the feature page. So for each of the features that we have listed here, and you can add additional features as well to this table. And you can, I think we would prefer that where you think we need an additional feature to actually comment on the bottom of the page. So just pop down here and say, I think we need to add the following feature to that. And then I can go and set up an upvote, downvote kind of widget for it if you do that. But what we've done is take our existing set of features here and added a Confluence widget to upvote and downvote these. That's just been made available, I think, really only at the end of last week. And as you go through, you can tick upvote or downvote, and we're going to use this in each of our technical design group meetings to prioritize which of the features that we want to work on first. Basically, what do we think is important and what do we think actually maybe even isn't important at all for us to work on in R1. So what you do when you've logged in, and you do have to log in, you should see yourself up on the top right corner. I've got a profile picture, but it'll either say up there, log in, or if you have, it'll just have something up there. And once you do, that means you can just basically tick if you want to upvote like that. And I've now been added to this. It uses your HL7 Confluence account. If you want to add a comment on something, maybe is why you're downvoting or why you think it's important, you can click on this little thing here, add a comment, and then type in what your comment is. Like I think, well, let's just have a tester comment here, test comment, and hit save. And then that will look like that. I wonder if I can get rid of that. See what happens if I just do that. Yay, okay, excellent. That's the way to get rid of them. You can delete your comments. So yeah, that's available now. I think, has someone dropped that in the chat? I had once, but I don't know if it's available to people who'd come later. So I'm just going to pop that in the chat again for people so that we can go through and use that. So we'll look to have an update and maybe order these rows for our next technical design group meeting. Any questions on this feature? Well, this page and what we can do with it. All right, I'm not hearing any, so let's move on to that next action. So that top one then is now done. On this next one was to start a data mappings page and to provide that to the group. Now, I did start one, and thankfully Andy has also sort of taken that on and gone further with it. And we've got that in our agenda to go through. So I'm going to leave walking through that for that particular part of the meeting. And we'll email out, I think, links to that at the end of this meeting. They'll at least be in the minutes. So let's move on from those actions and on to update in relation to the clinical design group. I got in touch with Kylie and she let me know that there weren't any further updates that needed to come on the AUeRequesting data for interoperability. But instead, what we needed to do was highlight that we've got the meeting coming up on the 17th of April. That's the out of session. That is the joint CDG TDG meeting for us to talk about and have a discussion through sex and eRequesting. The invites should have just been sent out, I think less than half an hour ago. If you didn't get an invite to this and you want to come along to it, can you please email FHIR@ciro.au? I'll just actually pop that, or can someone pop that into the chat? And we can then forward that to you. Thanks, Kylie. So that's really the only update that we need to do on that one. So Are there any questions about this? There's an agenda and a link off to the page there on what we're going to go through, but basically it is really talking about as a joint conversation, what are those concepts, get a background in what's AUCDI, go through the relevant HL7 gender harmony project and have that discussion on what we think we need to take through for eRequesting. So please come along. All right, that's really it for the updates. Now on to the real business of the meeting. So I'm going to hand over to you, Andy. Did you want me to stop screen sharing or just tell me to click next slide?
You can, there's only a couple of slides here, and then maybe I'll take over the screen sharing at that point.
All right, sounds good.
Jump ahead. This is just introduction to what we're about to get into. As Danielle said, there is some preliminary work around mapping the data model into FHIR. So Danielle started it. I went in with boots and all and just tried to complete all of the attributes that were there, at least as a starting point, rather than a blank sheet of paper. Ideally, we will begin to link those through to use cases as well. So Chris is on the ball to start doing that. So you will notice in the mapping page there, if someone can just copy that across, I guess I could. That page also has a column in for the link to the use case. There will also be other attributes that will come not from that original data modeling work, but more broadly in terms of some of the features that we are looking to support. Oh, or I could have done that.
I just figured since I'm still sharing, I may as well just have up the columns you're talking about.
Yeah, so hopefully none of that's too surprising for anyone. If you do have commentary, please add it in the bottom of the page or somewhere in there. This is by no means set in concrete. It's just a starting point for discussion.
Okay, I'll go back to... Did you want the next slide?
Yep, next slide. The other thing we briefly talked about last time was to begin to come up with some principles that would help our decision-making process when it comes to the implementation guide, in particular, allowing it to be something which is useful and usable at the end of this process, rather than something we put on a shelf and never visit again. So I started this. This is very, I guess, a personal kind of view at this stage, and I'm more than happy for others to throw comments in around this. Danielle, if you want to jump to that, have you got that principal page open somewhere?
I do. I'm just failing a bit, sorry, at slide navigation, but yes, I do. It's here, and I'll pop that in the chat as well now.
Okay. So we won't go through the whole thing here. I'll when I get the get control, I'll go through this. But particular, it's kind of the principle, a bit of a description of it, the rationale for why it was, I think, an appropriate principle, and some effort to document the implications for following that principle and what it might mean to our implementation guide work. And hopefully it ticks a few boxes when it comes to some of the characteristics of the implementation guide we're trying to create. So that's kind of where we're going to go today. Does anyone have any questions before I jump in? Alrighty, so if you want to let me grab screen sharing. Oh God.
We can see that, thanks.
But it's the wrong one. Hang on. There are too many windows open. I don't even know where that one is. All right, let's go to that one and all right, I'm going to go to the principles first, just to mix things up. So the first principle is really about the sanctity of FHIR. I mean, and this I'm looking at from an IG perspective, given that's the result of where we're heading in this. So in particular, it's trying to describe the fact that we need to keep in mind the primacy of the FHIR as a standard and the FHIR patterns, workflows, design foundations. Reason for doing that is we're not trying to circumvent the requirements that drive what we need to achieve, but more so to recognize the fact that this is bigger than just the eRequesting. This is about making sure that what we are adopting is going to be as generally FHIR friendly as it possibly can be, and to make sure that we're not creating exceptions in FHIR unless there's a really good reason for doing that. The second one is around the compatibility with industry implementation approaches and the reality of existing industry investments, and to make sure that we keep in mind that at the end of the day, we do want this implemented, and revolutionary changes to the industry is a very difficult thing to achieve, and it's much better to have a foundation which builds upon and can transition through and from existing investments that industry has already made. Third one is
Sorry,
around...
Andy, before we go on, are we going to, in this meeting, since we're walking through the principles, to also have that first impression, I guess, from the group on do we agree and think this is important and here's why? Or should we hold that to the end of the session?
Well, I'll do that at the end of just running through these briefly. I think at our last discussion last week around principles, I think there was a general agreement that having some principles was good. I'm not saying these are the principles. This was more about not starting from a blank sheet of paper. So we do need others to weigh in and comment. And even if you only have an idea for a principle, but you don't know what the broader kind of context of it is, then by all means certainly add those in. So just let me briefly run through these. One of the things I tried to highlight was ensuring that we allow for the incremental nature of investment by those who are going to implement, and that not everyone is necessarily going to be at exactly the same level all of the time. So to keep in mind that there needs to be a graduation of investment options, and wherever possible, allowing for those to be as backward compatible as we can and to be inclusive as we can, so as not to create such a significant, I guess, high hurdle that many would find it impossible to start the journey. The other one, and the final one I kind of came up with, was about the reality of achieving real world implementation and solving real world clinical and business problems. And one of the things I would say with eRequesting is it is in a very interesting position with the coexistence of the clinical need and the business need, which have to come together to allow for a implementation environment which meets both of those foundations and both of those building blocks, keeping in mind that there is a policy and regulatory underpinning that is here and now, and this could change and grow in future. So from an architecture perspective, making sure that we make sure we're keeping in mind the separation of the policy and the mechanism. We allow for lots of mechanisms, but we don't mandate policy within the implementation guide itself, but allow for that policy to be supported as it changes over time, to making sure that there are usable business models that can work with the implementation guide approach and the workflows, and to make sure it has a strong clinical value proposition to ensure it has a reason to be adopted beyond that which existing maybe solutions out there may already be covering. So those are the kind of the four that I kind of throw out there as a starting point. Does anyone have any comments on either these four or how they see this progressing? Excellent.
David?
Love them. What a great start. I wanted to just reiterate that I think government is very supportive of the principle of compatibility with existing industry implementation approaches. We think that that's really critical to the success of eRequesting and FHIR adoption generally, is to keep supporting the directions that industry are going in. Try not to put too many intensive guardrails in place, but work very closely with industry. The second is, I think I'd love to explore another principle around patient centricity, to be making sure that we don't repeat some of the even recent failures around things like e-prescribing, that we keep customer centricity front and center. And I think also an awareness of an ecosystem is probably something we should think about baking into the principles. But really great work. Thanks, Andy. This is very, very cool.
Danielle, did you note those down? Because I'll put in kind of starting positions for those and make sure I pointed David to help me fill them out. I don't know. I can note them down.
So just a thumbs up for compatibility, and then thinking about patient centricity and awareness of an ecosystem.
That sounds good. We also have a transcript. This is running in the background, providing a transcript, and Steph is our scribe who is taking notes. So between those things, we should be able to have that beginner content from what David just said.
Excellent. Michael.
Yeah, Andy, I had a look through these and they look really good. I think they're well thought through and articulated, and I certainly support everything that's in here. One of the things I noticed that in AU Core they've done as well is actually have a set of principles for inclusion in AU Core. So I think these are definitely great design principles. I'll just put it in the chat, but which helps when we're deciding sort of around scope and the like, about what's in or out of a particular release. And there might be something that we could work towards in addition to the design principles, about having some principles for inclusion and tailoring those for eRequesting. I don't know if you might be able to share that link.
You've put the link in the chat, yeah.
Yeah, I just put the one up in the chat.
Oh, are you asking, sorry, Andy, to click on it?
Yeah, whoever's sharing, I think it's Andy sharing the screen, might just
Yeah, I'm just looking for
the right window.
Right window, yes.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I have the same problem.
Oh, come on.
If you just want to navigate to it through Confluence, you
Yeah.
can go to the discussion area in under the AU core pages. It's the same kind of structure.
Yeah, you'd be on the same page. Yeah. There we go. Yeah.
Yes.
So some of the things in here definitely align to those design principles, like the current use, current exchange, current standards, type things, which align to some of the things that you'd mentioned there, but might help us as we go along trying to work out whether things are in scope or out of scope. Having something like this might help us sort of reach consensus more easily.
Yeah, I guess the only thing to note is that AU Core is a relatively broad church.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Scoping for AU Core, I think, is kind of a bit of a different beast. I think for eRequesting, there's quite a narrow focus of value and scope for it. So I think certainly going back to that scope is important for those inclusion and exclusion, because obviously, things like how deep do you go down specimen, for instance, support within requesting, and that's going to be, I think, strongly dictated by the scope that we choose, obviously.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be different to AU Core, absolutely. But and this is something we might build out over time, right? As we start working out how we're making our decisions, it might just help us to set the guardrails.
Okay. Ken.
Yeah, I agree. The principles are good. They're sort of general. The thing that I worry about is that we don't want to create problems, and we want to solve problems. And so, and then there's this issue. That's the sort of negative issue of the principles. But the positive issues is we want to. There are certain aspirations in the digital health plan, including, getting information for health economics and clinical decision support and so on. So I think that the principles need to be, a little bit more specific in the description, probably, rather than new principles about part of it, the issue of compatibility with existing systems is do not create new problems. It's a specific issue. Do not create issues which will become problems. And the interoperability issue is sort of, to solve existing problems. So it's sort of a clearer guidance about individual, components of requesting, to go back and say, well, that's faulty in terms of principle 1 and 2 because it's created a new problem. It's not really creating any, solving any aspirations. So, I think if they're too general, they just become, too broad to know exactly how to use them. If you provide examples based on the digital health strategy, based on the value that we're going to get out of interoperability specifically for eRequesting, based on the fears of the industry for the things that they might lose and the things that they'll need to do, the principles are fine, but I just don't know where, just let's say clinical decision support, where does it fit in that? Does it fit in interoperability? Because it is an interoperability issue. Is it an issue with the existing industry standard? Because there is an existing standard there is one model for clinical decision support. So it's a bit hard to know what issue you're prioritising with any particular item in the so I wouldn't, that in a way, those, as was just stated, those principles could apply to core just as easily as eRequesting. So if you make it specific to eRequesting with some specific examples in the description, it might be more helpful in the future when we're trying to prioritize which principle are we going to concentrate.
Okay, I could try adding in an extra column and with kind of examples, for instance.
Yeah, or examples, issues, which might be an example of the benefits or the risks.
Yep, we can try that. And if that is worthwhile populating, then we can populate it. All right.
Could you, Andy, go back to, because we can see the AU core ones at the moment. Could you go back to the starter set for the eRequesting principles? There we go. And I wanted to say two things, and I've gone last since I'm chairing. I'm going to wear now both my FHIR work group co-chair hat and the Sparked FHIR lead, for which has responsibility for technical governance of the FHIR standards that we're working on, and say that I think that first principle is critical. It is something we absolutely have to ensure that we are following in the eRequesting project as we work through these. This is a HL7 Australia FHIR standard we're working on, and I think it is crucial, and I really like the way that that has been phrased here. So well done, and thank you for including that. The other thing I wanted to ask about here is more of a chairing question. So now that this table is available for people to contribute to and review or provide some feedback on, how would you like that to happen, Andy?
Hang on, I just added something else.
Okay.
I think in the way we're talking it, I think people are going to get passionate about particular principles. It would be, I would find it useful if you do think that these principles are ones that you particularly think are important, that maybe people could put their name behind it under that endorsement kind of column as a starting point. I'm not really a fan of trying to kind of create this up front before we start the work. I think this is going to be something that grows with us as we go through it. I think adding a principle in there around solving problems is probably as important, and don't create new problems. I think they're good principles on their own, let alone being incorporated as part of the ones that are already there. So I guess I'd like two things. One is, if you do think one of these is particularly important, then I think maybe endorsement's too strong a word, maybe I'll change that, to put your name kind of in there to say, yep, we think this is important from an organisational perspective or an individual perspective. I guess the other one, say I'm interested in, is seeds or starting points for new principles that you think are important. So I guess that's why I'd like to progress this as other discussions go on around the work we do to come back and add into this principle set or seed new principles within it by putting comments on this page around things you think we should be including, or issues that you have with the existing principles.
I think that sounds like a good idea. Let's, I think we can do that. And I would suggest we also then need to send an email out. Not everyone's obviously at this meeting today, to provide a summary of that with a link to this page.
Sounds like a fine plan. Any other questions?
Andy? I was only going to ask if the clinical design group have a set of principles, and if so, how do they work together? Maybe worth looking at those to see whether there's opportunities there as well, right?
They do exist. They're highly, and I believe they're still in a PowerPoint pack. I don't think you guys still yet have a page
Not
We've
yet.
gone
We
and
work.
fished them out occasionally.
Yeah, we're working on our new website at the moment, so we haven't got them out yet. But they are fairly similar to what you have here, but they are really focused on the data elements and like our scope and what we're working on.
Just want to make sure there's no conflicts between the two, if you know what I mean, or
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the old Venn diagram kind of world, obviously there's an overlap, but there are things I think obviously from an implementation guide perspective are not really going to be in the realm of just looking it through the kind of clinical kind of design lens, particularly. So hopefully they work, as you say, without conflict. But yeah, I'll try to, maybe we'll look at a way of linking them at some point when there's another page I can kind of link to within the Confluence.
Can we have an action then, Colleen, if you're happy to accept that, to find a way to make those easily available for us?
Yep.
Whether that's
Yep.
just send us a copy and we can put it on our page and you can keep updating it, or whether that lives in the clinical web pages.
Yep. Happy to do that.
Thanks, Colleen. Heather?
I agree that we need to make sure that these principles work together, and I don't think that there is going to be conflicts in principles, but I think we're already starting to see some things coming up where the clinicians are looking at what's been traditionally done and saying, in fact, we'd like to do it differently, and how that then is going to impact on the compatibility with existing industry implementation approaches and so on. So things like pregnancy checkbox was pushed back on pretty strongly, and I know there's some concerns that from the technical group that this is a clinical safety issue, but in fact the clinicians want to address that this can be done in a safer way, in a better way, and that's going to be a negotiation that's going to be kind of interesting and tricky to try and bring together. So not principal issues, but like the practical issues of how we negotiate and sort of take this journey on and seeing how we can improve things as well. So just flagging that that's a kind of just practical implication that's not necessarily principle based, but it's going to be a bit sticky, I think.
Yeah, just to, I guess, state the obvious, but the focus of the implementation guide is on interoperability. So it's on an organizational contract that exists between two endpoints to share and support a data and workflow between a organizational divide. The work we're doing is not around designing a clinical information system. It's not putting constraints around how a user experience should be created. There will be interpretations into and out of the content of the implementation guide, and that is not going to, I think, be dictated by the IG itself. It is about defining the foundation of a contract, of a technical contract, over which, the flow of information and workflow is supported. David.
I agree with you that it's a technical contract. I think I've seen over and over and over in these discussions and different forums, whenever we raise a new inclusion for data, the question always comes back to, is that putting more workload on the clinician? Now, I know that there's wonderful ways of reducing that workload, but I know it does tend to cloud our thinking about adding, great additions, because there's a traditional mindset that everything we ask a clinician to do takes away from patient care and adds load to them, or discourages them from participation. I don't know how we solve this. We can't really go through and design out what every SIS vendor might possibly do to solve these issues. But it is something I'm seeing continuously, this pushback on behalf of clinicians and their workload.
So on that comment, I'll just give a warning here for time and time boxing. I think we want to keep this discussion to only a few more minutes to give a half-hour space to get on to the other part of this session.
Excellent. So let's make a transition, unless there are burning other issues. So data mapping. What we have previously looked at is the data model inclusive of clinical and some operational requirements as they were kind of discovered. We're going to go into too much detail on these. Danielle did a sterling job of translating these into a table with a data model starting point. And what we collectively have done is to look at the appropriate or most appropriate way that we could come up with to support those elements within the FHIR resources that we have in the most case previously looked at around service requests and tasks. I'm going to, I think, just meander my way through these and I will look for hands going up to ask questions about some of the potential choices that you'll see. There are a few in here that only a couple, that it wasn't clear to me that the mapping was obvious, but I've done my best to cover off most all of them. So, starting with the foundations of the service request itself. So hopefully most of you hung around when we talked about the nature of a FHIR service request being associated with a single requested item, and that there is then a set of items grouped together and supported through an order that is then made up of those individual elements. So in this case, when I talk about service requests from a FHIR perspective, I am, for the most part, talking about, in the case of pathology, a single pathology test, a single coded test, or a free text test, whichever it turns out to be. I'm talking about in radiology, a single service where you may have multiple X-rays, for instance, requested to be performed. They would be separate service requests. So with service requests name associated with service request code, type and category, service request has a category. I won't at this point jump directly to the FHIR spec. When you see that FHIR resource reference there, they're all hanging off the generic R4 service request spec. So do feel free to follow this up and follow your nose and what they really mean. Clinical indication, there is already something in there around a reason reference, reason codes associated with the reason for the request. Through a combination of those attributes, I think we can cover off the intent of indication and reason for request. Clinical context in a service request is more generally held under a big bucket of anything, which is supporting information. Supporting information can hold structured supporting information. It is possible that supporting information also allows for a parallel unstructured version, which is something that we've talked to with, well, Sonic have raised the issue around supporting information potentially with allowing for that unstructured narrative form, which is a core part of really the FHIR standard anyway. There is also clinical notes, which can include additional information in there. So that covers off that clinical context. Urgency, obviously to priority, there's an existing priority value set that we should probably look at as we're going down that path to make sure it covers off the desired granularity of priority, and also other implications associated with priority, including things like communication requirements associated with maybe urgent requests, for instance, and what is the semantics of that. Timing has actually got quite a broad set of support within FHIR. So the service request has a period or occurrence and quantity that I think covers off each of these needs, from timing, number of occurrences, frequency and period, and even more than that in terms of the constraints of timing, and that timing bucket there can actually be quite rich. So how much of that we want to enable and describe in the IG is something we need to discuss. Another one is around identifiers of orders. Ken might have some interesting comments on this, but so if you look at the version 2 world, version 2 has a rich set of identifiers. And this is typically one of the disconnects with FHIR. So FHIR has the concept of business identifiers associated with the service request. Don't forget, this is the individual test or radiology service request. The identifier could be associated with, and in this case, the word order could be interpreted as the collection of individual service requests, or it could be about the individual test element. I've interpreted this, I guess, in both ways, both in terms of business identifier potentially of an individual service request, as well as a collection of service requests. I have had lots of discussions with Angus around the business need for an individual business identifier for a test, and we collectively haven't come up with one. I'd be interested if anyone else has that. We obviously have a technical identifier in FHIR. We have an ID of that individual service request, so we can do things with that individual test or the individual radiology service. But in terms of being able to have people interact with them, that is something that we're less confident of. In version 2, there is that placer identifier that can be associated with the individual test. So I'd love to hear some more discussion around that mapping and whether it's, in a FHIR perspective, is a building block that we need. We certainly understand the need for the group identifier, the identifier of the order as a whole. That requisition ID has a crossover into barcodes, the ability to discover orders, all these kind of things, which obviously has a lot of business process needs sitting behind it, but less so the individual. No hands up, so maybe that's not as controversial.
Did you want to post something then to the group to get their comment, or do that after you've run through the table initially?
I will stop at any point through this if there is any commentary that the collective group wish to make on this. Certainly not your only opportunity. At some point as we dig into these issues, and it will, because of groups and the grouping of requests. From my last glance at the prioritization page, it was the top issue, so it will come out in that discussion. So there we will dig in deeper, but if anyone has any issues at the moment, feel free to raise your hand. Certainly happy to have that stuff now. That's who I was looking for. Ken.
Yeah, I mean, it just needs further discussion. It is quite complex. So at the moment, let's say in Sonic, we do have e-orders, which just represents a numbering system for orders. But a doctor may provide like 3 different orders, which are accumulated into a single request by the receiving. And he may change orders as well. So it is important. And not only that, but potentially in the future, when we have, various registries, you could have requests coming from different registries or being picked up from different with different numbers and conflicting with each other and different requesters. So we need to give that requesting side some thought. On the receiving side, usually we bundle all of those order requests into a single receiving episode, but then the laboratory may do their own other, specimen identification or, follow-up episode identification and so on. So it's like we were saying in terms of the principles, are we solving problems or creating problems? That's what this is an example of what I'm saying. So when we prioritize this, we'll be able to say, well, this is already a problem. We aren't able to solve it, but we haven't created a new one. Something like, we might be able to reach that point, but it's certainly, and that's also to do with this aspiration. It's the aspiration. If the aspiration is a high priority for patient selection and so on, well, then we have to make a way that orders going through different registries can be, understood by all players.
That's a very good point, and I agree that this does need some deeper analysis, and the granularity of those identifiers and the exposure of the identifiers. Obviously, the context in which elements are being identified within that shared request order collection needs to be understood. I think we certainly don't want to restrict behaviors that are working today. And as you say, we don't want to create new problems by overlaying constraints where they're not necessarily appropriate. And again, I think it comes back to the nature of our work around the implementation guide, that it's not restricting what the endpoint may or may not do with the information that is received through the implementation guide contract, how they represent it, or additional identifiers that may get created within those clinical information systems are certainly not something that we would restrict. Our focus in the implementation guide is on the shared view across this requesting that happens between the placer, the filler, and the patient involved in this. And we don't want that our limited set of information that we define within this IG constrains activity that has a clear value for one of those roles, but it's a shared, obviously the value is around the sharing in this case. So we will go into this when we talk about the grouping stuff, and that I think will cover off the nature of identifiers and the granularity of the order request collections. Request date time, we have two versions of that. We've got an explicit authored on, and we've got the nature of resourcing, the change in the resource itself. So when a element or some form of that, some content of that service request is changed, we will see it in the last updated. We do need to think about the relationship it has to the authored on, and when modifications are made, that we ensure that the correct semantics are available, are known to all parties who use this information. Billing is typically carried in a coverage resource, which is referenced from the insurance attribute of a service request. Experience in that is it's not simple, because the implications of specifying coverage within a service request need better understanding than potentially exists today, and especially if we're looking at this as a open, interoperable understanding. Is this a absolute, this must be the insurance coverage that's required, or this is a recommendation? What's the aspect of that, and what's the breadth of that insurance coverage? For instance, things like overseas travel insurance. The checklist is actually quite broad, and that's a very deep hole to dig ourselves out of. So we just need to look at that. At the moment, we haven't slotted it in for any release, but from a business implementation perspective, it's actually core to how clinical systems work together today. So it's not something we can easily just drop on the floor. Requester is both in terms of the service request and also in terms of the task. So that is covering both fulfillment and the specification of the test and who is requesting it. Obviously, practitioner role, giving reference to the individual and the organization which are associated at the time of that order. Copy to, I think is it is in our list of features and the priority for them. It is something that we need today in terms of support. However, copy to is also, at the moment, it's not slated for any release, but it is something that in terms of implementation needs a way forward. I think two ways to do it that we have come across, one being the extension that we asked for a couple of years ago, that we have in our palette at the moment, which mimics the version 2 use of copy to, but natively FHIR does support the concept of a communication request, which is a more generic foundation, asking a sending party to send and a receiving party to receive some communication about certain information, which is a far more FHIR friendly way of doing it, but it also changes potentially the obligation of communication. And so we need to think carefully about how the nature of the FHIR-based architecture versus a more traditional messaging-based architecture actually work for the sharing of information. Ken.
Just there are problems with copy 2 at the moment, which are, copy 2 was originally designed for being copies of an investigation to another health provider. But the other places where the communication is increasingly going to is either directly to the patient or through the My Health record. Now, they could potentially be covered by the one field, like where does this report then go to? It includes anybody, including other clinical databases, including the patient's own databases, or so how do we? And the upload to My Health record is well, it has to be. It's required by legislation now, so that has to be covered. So, and I don't think that US FHIR's got an equivalent. I don't think. So, would that communication request cover those other aspects of communications to patients, carers, My Health record, hospital databases, all of those things?
Yes, and it can. It's a very generic mechanism. I think it's an interesting, pretty foundational discussion on what sharing means going forward. I know David has some commentary on that. Obviously, there is also the nature of discovery. So rather than only directing copies of information to parties, there is obviously coexisting an ability to being I'm not currently on that kind of known distribution list, so therefore I want to be able to discover this stuff. So we've got to kind of think about that as well. We've also got the policy setting around My Health record upload, obviously the default to share with My Health record. I think there is a reasonable way of overlaying a set of pre-assigned kind of slices of communication request that would proactively document communication to patient, communication to other providers as well. So I think we should bite off that whole area when we do talk about the copy to and distribution discussion.
Thanks.
David, can providers see where they would get value from the insurance data being included? When you say insurance data, are you talking about?
I'm talking about service request.insurance.
Right, so the foundations of coverage, so the billing foundation.
I'm just curious. I don't know enough about how that's used currently. It is you've got it as a question there about whether it's included in R1. I'm curious to know whether it creates significant value for the providers.
I can only talk from my experience from a specialist perspective, and it absolutely is a core part of requesting that an indication of billing coverage is part of the service contract that exists between a requesting clinician and the pathology service. And Ken, if you want to wade into that.
No, it's absolutely. Yeah, I mean, 80% of requests in ambulatory care are bulk bill requests. So that's a statement required saying that the insurance is covered by Medicare. Whereas private billing may be, out of pocket. There's also veterans billing. There's overseas billing. And we do have standard codes for that. Otherwise, they're all just managed through a private bill and the patient organises reimbursement. But, that's really inconvenient if you can't have a direct way of assigning the...
No, that's really, I wasn't sort of challenging it. I was trying to better understand it. And that's, I didn't really understand how involved the order and clinician was in that discussion, but it sounds like they are very involved.
The other aspect of that for patient choice, which is another fundamental, I think, here, is that the insurance, statement by the doctor determines how much out-of-pocket charge there'll be for a patient, and the out-of-pocket charge of the patient may vary from provider to provider. So unless you're transmitting that, the ability of the patient to pay, then the provider can't actually tell them what the out-of-pocket charge will be.
So just before we continue this conversation, so I just want to, as chair, so we're going to have to time box some of this again. We're coming in. We've got, I think, maybe another 8-10 minutes before we'll need to move on to our last topic and close the meeting.
We didn't anticipate covering all of this today, to be honest. So we will come back and cover some more of this stuff. I just note that this is one example where the default FHIR kind of foundation from a value set perspective of what things like, for instance, insurance and coverage is kind of preset to cover. It does need refinement from an Australian perspective. So the out-of-the-box bit that FHIR provides is not really that useful. It's a much bigger set. Michael.
I was just trying to tie this up a bit. For things like that, where we're talking about billing insurance and haven't identified as R1, is that something we're saying that we do need to do work on then to, or is it something that can be pushed further down the road? Because it's something that could tie up a lot of time and a lot of effort when we're actually not planning on having inclusion in R1. And that probably, it's a broader statement, it doesn't need an answer now, but trying to identify whether this generic service request, whether we've got a level of comfort here with these mappings and identifying the areas that we need to do more discussion about. We identified, well, the identifier and its relationship to groups and the like is something that we probably need to talk more about. But looking for whether there's that general feeling that these mappings are looking pretty good for the generic service request and the scope of what we're looking at for R1. Is the group sort of got a level of comfort there, or do we have areas that we want to sort of put forward for further discussion on these?
I think the R1, like in this data mapping exercise, certainly haven't covered off all of those release issues at this point. It is something that we do need to make a decision about. Just know that from Ken's perspective, and I guess from mine as well, that it is an important operational aspect of successful eRequesting. So it's something that we can start with. We don't necessarily resolve it for perpetuity, but we do need some release commentary on some of these other things.
Yeah. Is that an action? No.
No, you said what you were going to say, Michael.
Oh, I was just going to say, is this an action we can take away from here for people to go away and review this and add their commentary in there about the specifically the ones we've gone through, but definitely go further than that through the others so that we can get some additional commentary in here about inclusion for scope, whether there's any issues we want to discuss across some of these mappings so that we've got some more targeted discussion on these.
So is that a suggestion for the group? With the release column is only partly filled out, I think, based on the original proposal that came to both, I think, the CDG and from the mind map. Only some of that's been transferred here. Is the proposal to ask the technical design group to consider whether they think these elements are R1, R2 before we meet again or over the next couple of weeks? Is that the suggestion?
I think it would help with targeting the discussion too. That if we could go down the rabbit hole on some things that aren't even going to be R1. So I think that would help if others think that would help. or not, and also the mechanism that we do that.
Okay, any suggestions for or any objections to asking the group to provide their opinions on that over the next couple of weeks? And then we just need to work out how we do that as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to get unwieldy if we try to vote it up and down. I think if we just, I do think it needs to be done. I think where there is a passion for some of these, I think we need some cases to be stated, potentially just in the commentary of this as we fill it out, because it will become a foundation for some of the things that we do put in a draft IG.
May I suggest that I believe almost all of those elements in the mind map have a default position already there. We could fill out the column table and then just ask people to note where they don't agree. Basically, that's one way that could happen.
Sounds good.
All right, we'll take an action. Someone on in Spark's side, maybe Michael Wilson, to populate that R1 column, and then we'll send out the email to the technical design group along with these like reviewed minutes asking people to undertake that activity. Are there any objections to that from the group? All right, let's do that. I know we're really coming up to time here, but Talwinder, your hand is up. Did you want to provide your comment or question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the time. And it's with respect to the copy to understanding is when we look into the request form, irrespective of number of tests, there is one field. Are we linking this copy to each test or at the order level?
That's a very interesting question. It kind of is. It depends. We need to position the role of the test group, I think, prior to making those calls. Then it's more around the mechanism. So the mechanism might be applied to an individual or a group, but once we get the positioning of the group decided, I think then we can decide whether to use a copy to or a communication request approach.
The way we are taking is that we might need to bring at things at order level and the test level, and then linking this communication request to the order level. That's the thought we are taking at this stage.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. It's like if these requests get split up, for example, to go off to different parts of labs and things like that, you don't want to lose any context like that. So I think if I understand what you're thinking, I would be saying, yes, we want to record the communication request once, but have multiple references to that single communication request.
Yeah, and this is going to be a question for a number of other parts or a number of other attributes that are common across the tests within an order. But also we have to be comfortable that going forward that we are allowing for potential future of how the whole order and the individual parts of an order might be treated going forward in terms of things like splitting and change management and stuff. So we do need to have that discussion, but I think if we carve off the group discussion first up, we then have foundations for these kind of decisions to be better made.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll ask now if there are no further final comments or questions. We need to move into our last topics around meeting cadence and next meeting. All right, let's do that, and I'll start sharing my screen. When I find the button. There it is. All right, so with me, I'll just pop down through again. Okay, so Meeting cadence. So we talked about the fact that we need to increase that in the last one, and a proposal was sent out to the group last week to provide vote or comment on. That's only had a few people respond. Several people have gotten in touch with me to let me know that they have issues with their account and could not vote, but have told me what that probably would be. The proposal that was put out to the group is that we do a few things. One was that we move to 90-minute meetings instead of 60-minute meetings so that we can talk through topics and go through to resolution or decision making, because the 60-minute meetings had really not been allowing us to do that. The other part of this proposal was to say that we should move to weekly meetings and alternate those days. Tuesdays, then Wednesdays, then Tuesday, then Thursday, alternating, which looks like that for April. We accept this and kick that off in our next meeting the following week. So that would be the 16th of April. And then we would have one other technical design group meeting in April on the 30th. And that is because the meeting we would typically have here, it falls on a public holiday. So what that would therefore look like then in May is going from 9th of May to then 14th. So weekly meetings alternating those days. Now we have had some people vote on this choice here. Now you have to be logged into Confluence in order for this to work, and you can tick affirmative, negative, abstain. And I'd like to open this up to comment or question now to the group, because we've only had a very minimal number of responses, and I don't think that is sufficient for us to shift to accept the proposal, as that affects the whole technical design group. So first off, can I get people who have any objections to moving to 90 minutes? If you want to raise your hand, and if you have any objections or comments you want to make on the proposal that we move to 90-minute meetings instead of 60-minute meetings. Okay, I'm not seeing that. I think that's accepted. The other part of this is moving to weekly. Does anyone want to comment or has objections on the proposal to move to weekly? Marvin.
So if you're going to do it weekly, do you then need the 90-minute meetings?
Yes, I think we do.
Okay.
I think the 90 minutes is required to, instead of splitting the introduction of a proposal and then its resolution across two separate meetings, I think that we have found that the 90 minutes, or at least I would then pose that to people today, we would have had to have been finished about half an hour ago. And I don't think we would have got through anywhere near what the content topic was. But that's my opinion. And we can choose to just say, no, we just want to do 90 minutes and we don't want to move to weekly. Are there any other additional comments or objections on moving to weekly? If we find that this doesn't work, we can adjust the proposal. We can re-raise that through the technical design group, including if we find we want to move days or times, and continue to adjust how we work, basically.
I think it's worth reiterating the comment that Andrew has commented on the vote around it may make it harder for regular participation due to clashes with day jobs. I think that's just worth reiterating while we're discussing this. But otherwise, the cadence needs to be the cadence.
Thanks, Marika. I think you've reiterated quite well. Okay, so if there's no further comments, can I ask, is someone happy to move to accept the proposal? Moving this out of an electronic vote and into a decision in this meeting, is someone happy to move to accept that proposal?
I'll move to accept that proposal.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
And I'll second it, Danielle. That's Matt.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks, Matt. So I do have a electronic poll prepared for this in case we needed to do that. So I will launch that now. Hopefully I did that right. There it is. If people can go through and select. Okay, those are coming in now. Still just waiting for some more people to vote. You can abstain if you don't think that you need to make that choice instead, so we still get the larger number of the people who participated to vote. And I'll just leave it there for another minute in case people are checking their calendars and making sure that that's something that they are happy to accept and try.
Danielle, I am wary that where there are people in this group who have a dedicated portion of their time associated with this work, it is obviously going to be more practical for them to, be able to do this. I do have concerns that we need to be careful about ensuring there's not a imbalance of input that we start to receive because of the this greater commitment that we're requiring. It does become more difficult to come in and out of these sessions, I think. So to go ahead with this, I think we do have we do need to do something proactively to track and to gather some feedback as we do this, whether we are falling into that trap. It has been an issue with standards work in the past, and I wouldn't want to see us create divides because of the additional burden that we're placing on active involvement.
I think that's really important. One of the things that occurs to me when you said that is that we can reconfirm this in the next month and also the month after to talk about what cadence do we want and make that something that we reconfirm when the dates and times are. This was obviously a generic proposal about Tuesdays and Thursdays, but we can make sure that we actually go, well, what days do we want to meet on as well? It's less of an issue, I think, potentially maybe for April, but certainly we can check again, maybe on that 30th of April meeting. Would that be a reasonable mitigation as well to add to the other things that I think we should do, whatever they are?
Yeah, I think if we look at attendance numbers as well and just see how they're tracking.
That sounds good.
And also, I think it's useful to track the range of the organisations represented, not just the sheer number.
Yep. That sounds good. So I might send out then, do we want to start this on the 16th? Do we want to start this next Monday? That was, yes, part of the proposal, but just to confirm that we want to meet on the next, what is that, Tuesday, the 16th? Should we put out the meeting invite and see if that's something that people can, based on who accepts and who rejects, if we have sufficient numbers to hold that meeting?
Yep. And would we just continue with the mapping exercise, given we didn't get too far through?
Yes, so the agenda for our next meeting is, I believe, then what we'll cover off. I'll stop sharing my screen. We have we'll talk about where the additional features prioritization comes up with, and I believe we did talk about continuing on this table and including maybe if we have any more feedback from the group at that stage on the R1, R2 aspect. Are there any other topics we want to schedule for that next meeting? And open to the group here. Is there a topic that you think we need to be adding into our next meeting?
Can we just revisit the principles just as a matter of course? I'm going to make some modifications based on some of the input today, and just to make sure that stays a current conversation.
All right. Sounds good. I'll add that. All right. If there are no further additions to the agenda, we'll bring this meeting to a close. Thanks, everyone, again. We'll see you hopefully next Tuesday, and we'll try out a Tuesday meeting, and we'll see how it goes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks for the time boxing.
It's a lot easier when it's a 90-minute meeting than when it's a 60-minute meeting.
Oh, great. Thanks.
That's
Bye.
right, Daniel. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.